Welcome to another episode of Simply Bitcoin Live. I mean, no, it's IRL. It's not live. It's been a very very long day. Anyways, today a very special guest, Alex Gladstain. Before I welcome him on the stage, I want to give a shout out to the awesome Bitcoin companies that make this show possible. Shout out to swanbitcoin.com. Best place to buy Bitcoin, built by Bitcoiners for Bitcoiners. And of course, Bitcoin 2023. Don't want to miss. It's going to be the biggest Bitcoin conference of the year, Miami Beach, Florida. You can take advantage of the promo code simply to get a 10% discount on your tickets. Anyways, I want to welcome Alex on stage. Alex, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, my pleasure, man. Happy to be here.
So I was on a plane ride back from, it was Colorado to Miami, and I ran into one of your pieces that the legend Guy Swan was covering, and I think I DM'd you right then and there. I was like, dude, this is absolutely incredible, and it really opened my mind to a lot of things. And basically, what I'm talking about, Alex, is you would think that the IMF and World Bank would be institutions that were bettering the human race. It was improving the human race, and I think that's really how they advertise themselves, but the reality is quite different, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that most Bitcoiners are aware that these institutions are up to no good. Especially the IMF, I think, has had a negative reputation among, let's say, leftists and libertarians. I think, for a long time. And look, you speak to people in the global South, and they immediately are, very skeptical of the IMF. But the World Bank has a much better reputation generally. And either way, I think most folks kind of in the mainstream would say something like, well, maybe they make mistakes, but, we really need them. We need a global lender of last resort, with the IMF, and we need a institution that's going to invest in infrastructure projects in poor countries where there, is not appetite from private capital in the case of the World Bank. So I think people just sort of justify them, even if they know there's some problems. But when you really dive in and look at what they've been doing in a meta sense, since the 60s, what the results have been, and kind of who they've allied with and what their incentives are, as I argue, it basically reveals that they've become a colonial force, that's emerged since decolonization in the 60s. They've helped kind of replenish some of those colonial flows that used to come into rich countries from poor countries through traditional imperialism. They've helped replenish those and help build that flow, so that since 1982, poor countries are subsidizing the quality of life of people in rich countries to the tune of these days, several $1 trillion a year. And I think that's what's, really shocking. The second thing is just the structural adjustment generally. Like it's not just the loans. It's not just the fact that these are not gifts. These are usually high interest rate loans where the borrowing country, will end up paying maybe $1.5 billion back on $1 billion loan, or maybe even $2 billion over the lifetime of the loan. It's not just that the flow is like coming the other way, and that these institutions and their creditors are making money off these loans and off, development. It's that the global South countries are being like engineered to be more kind of like dependent on us and less sovereign. And that's the really crazy part, is that, again, not only is it sort of a debt trap, but these countries are sort of forced to become dependent on buying, let's say like mainly like agricultural products, food from the West, and then producing stuff that we need. So this sort of, these are two things that are related in the spiral and the drain, I guess, that I've described.
So, and Why do you think, and you mentioned it earlier, right? You said what they've been doing since the 60s. And I know we don't have enough time to get into the nuance and get into the nooks and crannies of that, but I want to focus on, Alex, what they advertise they've been doing
Mhm.
and what they've actually been doing.
Well, when they were set up in 44, they're Bretton Woods institutions. So they were set up originally in a hotel in New Hampshire in 1944 by the Allies, by the winning side of World War II. They were originally set up to avoid what happened in the 1930s with global trade, where it kind of broke down and there was a lot of countries kind of pulling back away from trade to be self-sovereign. That wasn't good for people who make money on global trade, meaning countries like the US. So the Bretton Woods institutions were set up to prevent that from happening, meaning to keep the trade flowing. So, a lot of people think that that's a good thing, and that we should all just be comparative advantage, free market, making the stuff we're good at, and then trading with each other. I have questions about that. Let's say after doing this research about whether or not that's ideal, but put that to the side. The mainstream would say that's a good thing. Yeah, let's not have like trade breakdown. So, for example, the idea being post 44, if some country had like a crisis where its imports started to really outweigh its exports, that the IMF could step in and provide a 2 to 3 year loan to tide it over until it could get back on its feet. Ditto the World Bank, if some country like couldn't afford a really important hydroelectric dam, let's say, the World Bank would come in and lead a round with a bunch of other investors, and the local government could get that built. So that's what they're advertised for, and that's what essentially they do. It's just you have to think about the second order effects of that. And in the IMF's case, it means bailing out dictators for decades with a bigger and bigger debt pile that the citizens are always left holding the bag with. And the dictators really never personally have to pay it off, even though they skim 20-30% off the top. On the World Bank side, what it means is these enormous projects that the World Bank and its creditors and its allies benefit from through the dynamic of what's called the double loan. So, for example, the World Bank will help a big loan be given out to a country like Ghana or Argentina or Brazil, etc. And let's say it's $1 billion in today's money. So what happens is within the first year or two, that entire $1 billion gets spent by, let's say, Brazil on the Western companies who are going to build everything. So let's say it's a dam in Brazil. So the World Bank leads around. It's $1 billion in credit. Credit gets extended to the Brazilian government. Brazilian government pays $1 billion to have the thing built, and it pays Western companies. So the West has been paid back within a year or two right away. But Brazil now, the taxpayers of Brazil now owe principal plus interest on the billion. So when all is said and done, the West gets, let's say, $2.5 billion. They make a lot of money on this thing. And what ends up happening is that dam usually benefits them. Like, it's usually a dam that is basically powering, let's say, a mineral harvesting operation where 90% of the profits are going towards the West with really cheap, really below market cheap energy because of the dam. So this is not development in the true sense. It's not like the local population is being embittered or benefiting in any real way. Other people are somewhere else, and they're paying for it. And that's why what the World Bank does, is so sort of devious. Is it's sort of hidden away, but they really do accomplish the same feats as a lot of colonial dynamics, just by using debt as a weapon instead of a gun or a ship with cannons, etc.
So, Alex, why do they prefer dictators? Why is that?
Well, I mean, and we can debate about democracy and what does it mean and what's a democracy, but generally speaking, it's much easier for them to deal with a dictatorial client that can just put down protests with, or quell them at any time, because the structural adjustment policies that the IMF attaches to loans are not popular. They're called austerity measures. Like, nobody wants them. Everybody knows what's coming. The masses know what's coming. The masses know what's coming is currency devaluation, basically a recession, shrinking bank credit, more, rising taxes, rising interest rates, an end or like dramatically reduced subsidies for things like bread and fuel. Like that's what the IMF wants, and that's why people get pissed. So if it's a dictatorship, like Marcos in the Philippines, like it was easy. He didn't have to deal with a Supreme Court ruling him down, by the end of his term, or a legislature, like a Senate or a Congress, a House getting angry with him. He didn't have to deal with labor unions or whatever. He could just do whatever he wants, and he would shoot anybody or imprison anybody who disagrees with him. You try to do austerity on a democracy, people are going to be marching in the streets. The Supreme Court's going to be, kind of like vetoing maybe contracts with foreign companies. You're going to have people in the Congress or the Senate trying to overturn stuff. You're going to have labor unions pushing back. So, there's no perfect society, but these democratic societies are much more hard to deal with when you're trying to impose something on them, because the people can fight back. So that's why traditionally the IMF really preferred dictators who could just they could just be like easy clients to work with.
They can control them easier.
Oh yeah,
basically.
Yeah. I mean, a dictatorship is way easier to control than a democracy. Is the point? Where a liberal democracy, properly understood, that's much harder because power is decentralized among different parties. You don't just have the military. You have the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch. You have the media. You have labor unions. You have lobby groups. You have like this, all kinds of different people kind of jostling for power. And they're not going to like someone coming in and like crushing their economy so that people can get cheaper stuff in other countries, can buy their stuff for cheaper. Dictators don't care because they can take a percentage off the top of the new money flowing in, and like everybody else be damned.
What are your thoughts on democracy, Alex? And I'm asking this from the angle of, I'm sure I'm sure you know this, but some Bitcoiners, better said, feel a certain way about democracy. I'll be honest with you, Alex, like maybe the last 2 years, I'm starting to feel a certain way. But the thing is, though, is that what is the better? There is no better alternative to it. And I think Winston Churchill had that amazing quote, right? Like, this is the worst system is the best we have, something like that. I totally paraphrasing it, but what are your thoughts on this, specifically after you've gone down the rabbit hole? Because I think Bitcoin makes you think of it differently. I don't know.
Well, Bitcoin has reinforced my passion for liberal democracy and my distaste for dictatorship and tyranny. If I just were to be short about it. I mean, the classic example would be North Korea, South Korea, right? You have a dictator king in the north, and you have a liberal democracy in the south. And you look at a satellite image, and any toddler could point to you what looks like a nicer place to live. And that's because of some basic things that liberal democracies protect that dictatorships don't, and they include rule of law, private property, and free speech. So this is why Texas is like a better place to live than Tibet. I think especially like, democracy is all, is such a big word, but local governance of democracies tends to be like decent. Federal or like national governance in democracies tends to be not great. But like when you look at that society, it's extremely complex, right? It goes from the national to the village level, right? And when you don't have secret police in your town, like this is just a positive thing, right? So people's rights are just much better protected in a place like Texas than in a place like Tibet. And I would hope and imagine people understand that. Like there's a huge, huge difference. There are a lot of issues and problems with democracies. But I think those relate a lot to fiat currency. Like I think that if you have liberal democracies with on a Bitcoin standard, I think that's where I'm signing up for. Like, I think that's going to be awesome because that really limits the government. It prevents them from stealing a lot of the wealth from the people and making decisions that the people aren't authorizing. You can argue that, post 71 fiat currency has really, damaged democracies quite a bit. And I think that if governments aren't allowed to like borrow without asking from the people to do war and stuff, which they won't, which will be much harder to do, by the way, in a Bitcoin standard, then I think we get closer to the sort of the more ideal government. But yeah, I mean, I can't fault anyone for criticizing the post 1971 democracies. I mean, I can't. I mean, they've done horrible things abroad, and that there's been some like serious like social erosion inside. That being said, I mean, I certainly, I just, visited, for example, Costa Rica, and before that Ghana, and before that India, and before that Norway. I mean, these aren't perfect countries, but they're democracies. India being the one that's like most problematic, but I mean, generally speaking, these countries have rule of law, free speech, and they really they outshine their neighbors in many ways. Like if you think about Nicaragua next to Costa Rica, oh my God. If you think about, something like Belarus next to Norway, or something like China next to India, or something like Zimbabwe next to Ghana. I mean, it's not close. I don't think it's close where people would prefer to live in. I think that people would prefer there's reasonable people can disagree, but I think people would prefer the like, more open society. As far as Bitcoiners, yeah, I mean, I think that it would make sense if Bitcoiners were like against the surveillance police state type stuff. It would make sense that that's kind of what they're here fighting for. But that being said, I think eventually everybody will be a Bitcoiner, more or less, and we're all gonna have different opinions. Like already, there's Bitcoiners who seem like totally cool with a aggressive authoritarian police state. All these people supporting Bukele seem like totally fine with that. They don't see any issues with, a sizable minority of the people just having all their rights taken away, as long as it makes like, as long as the guy's saying the right things. They have no problem with this whatsoever. And in fact, if you criticize that guy at all, they get really pissed off. So already we've got like a small group of Bitcoiners who are like pro-statist police state, which like to me is just crazy. But I think that's just going to expand. Like you're going to have all kinds of ideologies inside Bitcoin. I mean, started with like a bunch of like cypherpunk libertarians. That's not where it's going to end, man. I mean, I've talked to communist Bitcoiners in Cuba who are communists, like they believe in the revolution. They see the Bitcoin as positive because it can hurt the dollar empire. And by the same token, I've seen pro surveillance police state Bitcoiners who are Bukele stands. So I think this is just going to expand, and it's just going to like become more divergent, and it'd be very hard to say like, what is a Bitcoiner in 30 years? That's going to be a very difficult thing. Other than that, we all believe Bitcoin is cool, right? I think it'll really shrink our, the dietary stuff, the political stuff. It all gets the health stuff. It all gets it will all get diffused. The thing that we'll all think is cool, I think, is just that like we want Bitcoin and that we want it to succeed. I hope that makes sense.
No, it totally makes sense, and I agree with you. By the way, I think that a lot of the problems let's talk about the states, right? Definitely comes from the alignment or unalignment of incentives between politicians and their constituents, because politicians, in my opinion, of course, they're more interested in getting as close as humanly possible to the money printer.
Totally.
And I think that's an incentive thing. So, Alex, I wanted to ask you, because we have to cover this topic. We do a live show every single day, and we're slaves to the news cycle. And this troubling development that I've seen over the last couple of months, which is the hostility by the Biden administration towards the industry. And Nick Carter actually released this phenomenal piece. I think it came out it was yesterday or today. The name of the piece is called Operation Choke Point 2.0 is underway. And in that piece, basically, he makes the case that the Biden administration has, they're hostile towards the industry, which makes perfect sense, right? Why wouldn't you be hostile towards something that could
listen to
potentially
this.
Go ahead.
I just shared this. There's a reporter from Fox who just tweeted, "Scoop: Gary Gensler is embarking on a midnight massacre in an attempt to bring all of crypto under his control. In the coming weeks, the SEC, NYDFS, and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the OCC, they'll be bringing a myriad of enforcement actions against exchanges and banks." And in the last 24 hours, you've seen this, right? You've seen people go after Paxos, which is like the issuer of the Binance stablecoin. You've seen Kraken get hit with a huge fine. You saw Coinbase starting to come under the pressure. So I think, and a lot of this relates to staking services, is where I think they're going after to start, which might have very interesting effects on Ethereum. I mean, it might actually force people away from using these big custodians. We'll see. But the point being, we could be heading into like a really intense year for like regulated cryptocurrency businesses in the United States, which look, we've seen this happen before in China, in India, in Nigeria. We've seen it get so extreme that like in countries like Nigeria, it's like illegal for a bank to service someone who uses cryptocurrency, essentially. Like they go after the on-off ramp, right? Now, what does this do? Is it pushes people into peer-to-peer marketplaces, and that's what happened in Nigeria. And it does not kill Bitcoin, that's for sure. Now, it's never happened though in the hornet's nest before. Like, we've never seen this before, so no one knows what it's going to do. Is it going to tank the price? Is it going to trigger the price up? Is it going to hamper innovation? Is it going to spark innovation? I think you can make a great case for all this stuff. We just don't know. It's very bad. I don't think it's great for like tokens. That's for sure. For tokens that claim to be decentralized but are actually centralized, like this is these are not good developments. Like this is why we created Bitcoin, because the like stuff that actually has a group of actors who control it, they're gonna go down with the ship when the state really turns on the heat. Bitcoin seems decentralized enough that it can withstand this. We'll see. I think that devs are feeling really feeling the heat right now, developers. So we need obviously a lot more pseudonymous developers, and we need ways of financing and supporting those pseudonymous developers. But hey, man, I mean, I don't know if first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you. Like, I don't know if this is fight you. This still might be laughing, but we're getting there, and it's pretty intense. But it comes at a time of honestly really exciting time for Bitcoin. I mean, like, what can I say? I mean, global adoption exploding. I mean, the Nostr stuff's really exciting just because I think it's giving us a new area to talk, where the big traditional social platforms are, I think, could face a lot of stress right now. And the Nostr thing's awesome. I mean, it took me a while to figure it out, but really, like, yeah, you're not gonna be using the global feed. You're gonna be using your own feed, much like your own Twitter feed, and there won't be any censorship, and you manage your relays properly, and you're gonna get a good, healthy stream of the content you want to see, and there won't be any spam, and it's gonna be a pretty awesome experience from what I've seen. And the integration of Lightning on it is just super slick, and I really love the. I gotta say, the ordinals inscriptions thing is fascinating. I think it's bringing a lot more people into Bitcoin at the right time. I think it'll fade, certainly, from like the big being the big thing we're talking about to being something that's sort of on the side. But it certainly doesn't help to have a healthy fee. I mean, it certainly doesn't hurt to have a healthy fee market. I think that's going to be important in the coming years. It's bringing a lot more people into running full nodes. I mean, you got Discord channels out there where there's like hundreds of people from altcoin communities coming in and running full nodes so that they can participate in this. I mean, this is really bullish. I think eventually they figure out how to make phone apps so that you don't have to do that. But the point is that it's kind of a very exciting time for Bitcoin. There's a lot happening right now.
Yeah. No, and I totally agree. It's definitely a very exciting time, but I also agree that it's weird. Look, the way that I describe it, Alex, is you see the dark, ominous clouds on the horizon, and you get little trickles of rain, and then you're like, okay, are they above me? Are they quite like, are they not here yet? But I think that there's an inevitable clash, Alex. I can't get
I mean,
around
I
that.
guess, but we've seen some big stuff. Like we saw the Chinese government basically ban mining. Like that was really intense. Like I'm not sure people like as far as Bitcoin goes, that's as close to like an infrastructure attack we could get. That was like the world's biggest dictatorship, just trying to punch Bitcoin in the face. It lost a massive amount of its hash power, like in a week. Like the network went all the way down. I mean, we're at like 300 right now. It went all the way down to like 70 or 60.
Mm-hmm.
It was insane. And yet it kept going. Like nobody's services were like affected. It was like not a problem. So, I mean, that was really inspiring to me. I mean, obviously, Gox was intense in the early days, but you've had like these big moments where it looked like Bitcoin was going to go down, and it kept going. So, obviously, block size wars, Gox block size wars, CCP shutting off mining. I mean, these are pretty serious things. I mean, right now you're seeing, the big one is the attacks on centralized staking services and stuff like that. I mean, Bitcoin node runners and sovereign users are just kind of watching. I mean, the most impact at the moment is on the price. So we'll see. I do think that the Supreme Court in the United States, for all the people who like the trash democracy, is going to be very helpful, because I think that having an independent judiciary, which is part of a liberal democracy, is extremely important in terms of preventing the executive from doing whatever they want. I mean, you live in a kingdom, there ain't no Supreme Court. Let's just remember that. So all these hypocrites that went to the Satoshi Roundtable in Dubai, or at least the organizers, there were some good people who attended, but a lot of the people who went there are total hypocrites because they're out there, blah, 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 blah. What? 2 days later, the dictators who run Dubai banned all privacy coins. They're going to go on the attack against all unregulated use of cryptocurrency. That's not a place to be like gathering to talk about cypherpunk stuff. That's an authoritarian regime that is built on slave labor. Like there's some weird shit going on there. But the point is that we're things are definitely going to heat up, but I'm confident in the community's ability to fight back.
Have you read, and I am too. Have you read the piece by Corey Clipson, The Race to Avoid the War? And I'm going to connect it with, and I'm sure you've seen this speech, Alex, the speech by Saylor at the Atlas Gala. Right? He's like, I don't want to be a martyr. Right? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I didn't get a chance to fully absorb either of those pieces, but feel free to do a TLDR or tell me what you want, where you want to go here.
Yeah. So the point is that I think the point that I'm trying to make, Alex, is that I think that Bitcoiners from all walks of life, whether you're the CEO of, big, Bitcoin company, or, the CEO of a big public company like MicroStrategy, I think we all feel innately what's at stake. And I think that a lot of people see the big, because I think we always make the joke, or the U.S. government's the final boss, right? But at the same time, right, how much power does the government have from being able to issue money for free that everyone else has to work for? That's a huge privilege, and they're able to get away with all this deficit spending because they have that capability. Why would I don't see them just willingly handing over the keys and saying, "Hey guys, it's all you."
They don't really seem to. We're not there yet. Like they're not really grasping it. Like they're going after. They're trying to protect their own seigniorage ability first against things like stable coins and crypto tokens that represent dollars, and against competitors to bonds. So the U.S. government does not want competitors to bonds. They want you to stake with them, right? So all these other these crypto staking services, and they want you to use their dollars, the ones that they completely control, not these other dollars, right? So what you're seeing right now is the U.S. government start to fight back a little against people who are creating alternative staking and dollar services. We have not seen a full-throated hey, we're worried that Bitcoin is going to take away dollar market share from global users thinking about what do I save in or what do I transact in. And to be fair, they'd be correct in assessing that that's not quite happening yet. But they're not even, I don't see that really here. And the good news is in America, again, we have checks and balances. So we have good senators and governors who are fighting to have Bitcoin mining in their state, who are going to fight for the right for you to self-custody, who are going to fight against things like unrealized cap gains, things like that. Those won't just be able to be imposed in the United States on people because we're a liberal democracy, because we have a Supreme Court, and because we have labor unions and all these other things. And the longer it goes that they don't attack like Bitcoin self-custody and Bitcoin mining in this way, the stronger we get. And the more unpopular it will be, again, in a democracy, there's voting, the more unpopular it will be to go after Bitcoin, and the more likely you'll be to lose your seat if you're anti-Bitcoin. Like, I really firmly believe that one of the reasons liberal democracy works so well with Bitcoin is, like, I think 6 to 8 years from now, it'll be political suicide to be anti-Bitcoin. Whereas in a dictatorship, there aren't elections, so government or king or the Dubai Emirate or whatever, they don't have to listen to the people. They can just do whatever they want. So it doesn't matter as much for them. You're out there living in Singapore or Dubai or Rwanda or you know whatever, Bukele. I mean, El Salvador. Name the semi-authoritarian or fully authoritarian regime that some Bitcoiners seem to think is cool. Like, hey, when the rubber hits the road, like, you don't have any protections in those places. In the U.S., you got protections. Like, it's a different system. Like, it's a rule of law based, Supreme Court based system. So I feel good that the superpower still has that in its DNA right now. That's very helpful for us, as Bitcoin is like bootstrapping essentially. I mean, eventually you go long enough, it doesn't quite matter. But right now, I think that's helpful.
What is the ideal case? Like the ideal, like, because I think, obviously we're expecting worst case scenario, right? But what is the ideal case for this transition?
I mean, I've thought about that a lot. I think Saifedean has a great course that he has for free on his podcast about this. It's like the summary of his fiat standard kind of course. And I'd be hoping for like a gradual transition to a Bitcoin standard. I think a explosive, some sort of catastrophic explosive like thing would be really devastating, because basically what you're going to have is an unwinding of like the sovereign debt bubble. It's like $90 trillion. So over time, and the corporate debt bubble, $60 trillion, and like a whole hell of a lot of that is going to melt into Bitcoin. But also real estate, which is, in that ballpark, gold is 10 trillion. So you have all these asset classes that are over some amount of time, in my view, going to melt mostly into Bitcoin. I still think companies and governments will always be able to issue debt for the promise of more money denominated in whatever the reserve currency is. Like in the Bitcoin standard, it'll just be sats. Like, hey, give us X number of sats, we'll pay you back this much more later. And there will have to be a big discount because people will be more fearful of lending. But I don't see corporate and national debt going away. I just think it's in a massive bubble. And as we transition over the next few decades towards a Bitcoin standard, I think those bubbles start to unwind. And I hope it's basically done in a way that's gradual enough so that it doesn't hurt too many people, because it's going to be bad no matter what. Like, it really will. So that's why we need to educate as many people as possible now about self-custody, because things are going to get really hairy as the fiat system starts to like essentially evolve and essentially like decline, I guess, in a way.
Yeah. And I completely agree. I think one of the tragedies that I've noticed, Alex, is that if you pitch an Argentinian or a Venezuelan or someone from Turkey, say, hey, here's Bitcoin, non-government money, cap supply, take self-custody, dude, it's like, where can I sign up?
Yeah, exactly.
How can I sign up for this thing? And then in the US, it's like, why do I need that? Exactly.
Get that away from me.
Mm-hmm.
I could go to prison or whatever.
Yep.
Yeah, people. Yep. Well, it's financial privilege, dude. And I mean,
mm-hmm.
Eventually, though, like the chickens come home to roost or whatever. Like, seriously, like as soon as like you get deplatformed or your something happens with your bank account, or you start having trouble sending a wire abroad, or I mean, you name it. There could be any number of like trigger items that get somebody to go into Bitcoin. I think those trigger moments are going to like really intensify in volume over the coming years. Like you're going to see a lot more deplatforming. You're going to see a lot more have trouble, technical and liquidity trouble with traditional financial services. I mean, look at Lebanon. I mean, I think you're going to have trouble with both national and private banking. You're going to have crises in both. You're going to see a lot of issues moving money from A to B if there's conflict or a breakdown in trade or communications. Like you're just going to see a whole hell of a lot of problems, and every single one of those is like a moment that's going to mint a new Bitcoiner out of necessity. So this is why we have so many tens of millions of Bitcoiners, or at least people who use Bitcoin, I guess to say loosely. It might be paper Bitcoin, it might be custodial, etc. But at least they're on the journey. Let's put it that way. They're at the beginning of the journey. They're at the bottom of the hill, but they're climbing up the hill. Okay, you've got people climbing up the hill. You got tens of millions of these people climbing up the hill, and a lot of the global South, right? And I hope they just get a head start. That would be the most like just thing, and the most historically perfect thing would be for the people who had been subjugated by colonial powers to get a better head start than their former masters. Like that would really be something. So that's like what I'm hoping for. I mean, who knows? Maybe it won't work out, but it certainly seems to be working in that direction at the moment, basically from what I've seen.
And I completely agree. It's beautiful in a way because it almost feels like cosmic justice.
That's what it is. Yeah, that's what it would be. But we don't know yet. We don't know yet. And look, if the U.S. government, against all odds, if Gensler and Biden end up being able to, somehow win an arm wrestling match against the courts and the Congress, and they can impose some of this stuff in America, it causes a chilling effect. And those miners and devs and companies are just going to go somewhere else. And maybe it ends up being more like a cat and mouse or like a whack-a-mole game, but they're going to go to Taiwan, or they're going to go to some of these partially authoritarian places that are going to allow that innovation for a certain amount of time for a political aim. But just don't. I would caution people when they think about a place like El Salvador or Singapore or Saudi Arabia or Dubai or whatever. Like, just know that you're there at the pleasure of the ruler, and like as soon as they're tired of you, like they're going to get rid of you. Now, maybe getting rid of you is bad for business, and maybe you do have a solid era there. But just be careful. But I do think that worst case, bad shit goes down in the United States. People just go elsewhere.
So that's the case you're making, and now I'm starting to understand you, Alex. Okay, so the case that you're making is, as long as things are politically aligned with these authoritarians, right? Whether it's Saudi Arabia, I love Bitcoin, but as soon as things go against them, is what you're making the case, that it becomes incredibly hard to fight them in those jurisdictions versus
impossible. Well, by the way, the only one who says I love Bitcoin is Bukele right now, which is again great, and I've been on record saying it was an awesome move for him to have Bitcoin as the national currency. Love the volcano mining, love the Bitcoin bonds, lots of good stuff. Love giving the middle finger to the IMF. I mean, the problem is that he's putting tens of thousands of people in prison without a due process. I mean, the problem is that he's spying on his opponents using Pegasus software. I mean, these are not. I mean, the problem is that he's changing the law so that he can rule forever. I don't know. He's a young guy, and he's getting rid of the independence of the courts and the attorney generals so that they stop investigating him. He's also stopping some really important investigation into war crimes in the 80s because whatever, he probably cut a deal with the military. The point is that like these are worrying trends if you're thinking about property rights in the future. As long as you keep your mouth shut, you don't criticize him, you're going to be fine, I think, in the near term. But you never know. Same thing in other places. Like if you're just some tourist or a client and you have a conference in Dubai and you keep your mouth shut about the government there, they're freaking delighted to have you. But as soon as you open your mouth about the government, watch out. Same thing in Singapore, same thing as any of these places. Whereas in the United States, it's like, I mean, you can go give a middle finger to Biden all day long and run your business. And like, I mean, generally speaking, you're going to be fine. It's just very, very different. And you could say the same thing in a bunch of other democracies, generally speaking. But look, the point is that where the democracies have broken down, I do think it's very clearly related to fiat currency. And I do think that Bitcoin fixes this in a way. Like, I think Bitcoin fixes democracy is my point. If you were to put our conversation in 3 words, Bitcoin fixes democracy, because I think democracies have been disabled and infected with fiat currency, essentially. And I think that they'll be much better off on the other side. Whereas I think tyrannies and police states are going to have a really hard time on the on the Bitcoin standard, because basically, like, if you think about what Bitcoin is, it's free speech, property rights, and open capital markets. These 3 things. So those vibe with the American values that America was founded on, the principles of the Declaration of Independence. But if you think about what tyrants need, or autocrats, or strongmen, they need the opposite. They need censorship, right? Censorship, confiscation, and closed capital markets. This is what China and Russia need to survive. They need censorship, they need closed capital markets, and they need confiscation. So Bitcoin makes it really hard for governments to impose those things on their people. So if you have like a political construct whose DNA resembles the values of Bitcoin, like, I think that's going to vibe pretty nicely. We're talking 30, 40 years out. So I don't see these like dictatorial powers doing that well in a Bitcoin standard. I think it becomes really hard for them.
Yeah. Interesting. It's fascinating. It's just one of those things, like Bitcoin fixes this. So
Yeah.
you were talking about it earlier, where just way before in the beginning of the conversation, but I was meaning to ask you, but we just, got carried away in this conversation. About the IMF and the World Bank, we know how the current system works. What would be the alternative to that system?
Yeah. So look, in a Bitcoin standard, you could still have a global lender of last resort, and you could still have like a supranational lending institution that would help in poor countries, but they would be very limited in terms of their power. They would really have to think carefully about the loans. They'd have to be pretty prudent. If a client country has continually said, no, we're not paying you back, instead of bailing them out again with this like infinite fiat machine that we've been able to do, we have to let them go bankrupt, which is a healthy part of capitalism, right? The problem is, like, in our world, what's happened is that the banks that are the ultimate creditors of, let's say, the World Bank or the IMF, et cetera, the Western private banks, the loan that they make that eventually goes to these third world countries is an asset on their balance sheet. So they don't want to see that go to zero. They would rather, when like Mobutu in Zaire, when he was like, thanks for the money, a couple years later they come to collect and he was like, I don't got it. Rather than let him go bankrupt and write off the loan, like, there was pressure from like the creditor side to just create another loan and just to keep the party going. And that's why you've seen the external debt of the third world go from, I don't know what it was, like 100 billion or something in the early 1970s, around when the fiat standard began, and today it's like got like many trillion dollars. I have all the data in my piece, but we're talking about an exponential rise in external debt, where countries would have a couple $100 million, and now they have $100 billion in external debt. And that's because, like, instead of, whenever they did fail, instead of going bankrupt, starting over again, they would just get another loan, and this would go forever. That's not possible in a Bitcoin standard. So I think the lenders have to be a lot more careful, more prudent. I think World Bank projects would have a lot more skin in the game. Like, the people investing in it would have to like actually assess, like, is this going to work? Is this going to make money? Or is this going to be some like failed project that the local government's just going to like take 30% off the top and let it rot in the jungle afterwards? Like, this is like, so I think it's possible these things still exist in terms of what they were founded to do. I just think that they have like a little bit more limited of an influence, which is healthy. I don't think they should have dramatic influence over these countries. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And I agree. And I think that it will be a more fair system.
Yeah.
And then a lot of people don't like, and of course, this, Alex, like, a lot of people don't understand that those bailouts come with so many conditions that is it really like, for example, the one in Argentina was fascinating, right? Where
Yes.
the IMF was like, hey, you must de-incentivize the adoption of Bitcoin while the country
Right.
is suffering
Right.
from 95% inflation.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think that they're going to fight that back in that way. And we're just, I just, let's stay on guard here, but let's be hopeful. Like we have a very powerful tool here to fight back. Um, I know that there's disagreement over like what kind of societies this leads us towards. I know some people think it leads to a total disintegration of the modern nation state, the Westphalia system, and it kind of leads to like much more local governance, and it kind of getting rid of the representative democratic model. Maybe that's the case. Maybe that's the case. I think local governments is awesome. It's much better. I mean, much better to like kind of have your rulers be people you know and you see rather than like 1,000 miles away. I mean, I'm totally on board with that. I just tend to think again that what this leads to is just more honest government and government that's more accountable to the people. That's what democracy is all about. It's about accountability. Um, that's what it is. I mean, again, property rights. I mean, you can't have property rights unless the government is accountable to the people. I mean, and that matters. I mean, because look, Bitcoin gives people the real property rights. That's awesome. But you still need a house. You still need to incorporate a business. Like, I mean, these are things where we need the old property rights, meaning like property rights derived from men with guns. Like you do need that. Like you do need that for houses and for businesses. You don't need it for Bitcoin. It's invisible, and we can protect ourselves with math, and it's cool, and we like that. But not not the stuff we're going to need for our daily lives beyond money itself. We're still going to need rule of law for that. And I think that Bitcoin drives us to have a more honest and accountable rule of law system, which is much more associated with liberal democracy than with tyranny or kings or whatever, lords, feudal system, God knows what. So we'll see where it goes. But I think it's pushing us, it's paddling us in like the right direction. Yeah,
Absolutely. It's one of those things where Bitcoin fixes this.
totally.